The ride back to base was a journey through a soundscape of silence and ringing. The roar of the firefight had been replaced by a high-pitched hum in Jacob Barnes's ears, the protest of his auditory nerves against the sudden violence. Inside the Humvee, the air was thick with the smell of cordite, sweat, and the unmistakable metallic tang of spent adrenaline. No one spoke. Words seemed inadequate, obscene in the face of what had just happened. Jake stared outside, but he didn't see the landscape. He saw the face of the dead man, his eyes open to the indifferent sky, the dark stain spreading on his tunic. The image was seared onto his retinas, an infinite loop in a personal horror film. He looked down at his own hands, which were gripping his rifle. They were steady, but they felt like they belonged to someone else. They were the hands that had pulled the trigger, that had participated in the chaotic dance that resulted in the end of a life. He felt a wave of nausea, a revulsion that rose from his stomach. He remembered his father's promise, his grandfather's compass, the ideals of protection and honor, and he wondered how that image, the image of an innocent civilian lying in the dust, fit into any of those noble notions. The silence in the vehicle was not one of peace, but of individual processing, each man locked in his own echo chamber of trauma, the sound of the real war reverberating in their souls. Back in the precarious safety of the base, the reality of the military machine reasserted its control. There was no time for reflection or grief. They were immediately led to a briefing room for the after-action report, AAR. The room was cold, the air conditioner humming, a violent contrast to the heat and chaos of the street. A captain, a man who had not been with them, sat at the front with a clipboard. The squad leader, Sergeant Wallace, narrated the events in a flat, clinical voice, devoid of emotion. He used the jargon of war. Contact, sectors of fire, collateral casualty. The death of the old man, the event that had torn the fabric of Jake's reality, was reduced to two cold, bureaucratic words: collateral casualty. Jake listened, feeling a helpless anger build inside him. They were dissecting a moment of terror and turning it into a series of data points, into lessons learned for the next time. Fire Team Barnes's response was effective in suppressing the threat, Wallace said, and the captain made a note. Jake felt as if they were talking about someone else. Effective. He had fired his weapon in a general direction, panic guiding his actions more than tactics. The raw, visceral, terrifying experience was being sanitized, packaged in a language that made it palatable, manageable. It was a necessary lie, he realized, the way the institution processed horror so it could keep sending men to face it. But to Jake, it was a desecration of that man's memory. That night, sleep was a foreign country to which Jacob Barnes had no visa. He lay on his bunk in the dark silence of the container, and the war he had kept at bay during the day came to claim him. Every small sound from outside, the creak of metal, the distant shout of another soldier, made him jump, his heart hammering in his chest. The adrenaline of combat had passed, leaving behind a toxic residue of hypervigilance. He closed his eyes, but the darkness offered no relief. It became a screen for the projection of his memories. He saw the muzzle flash of the enemy rifle. He felt the impact of his body on the ground, and above all he saw the face of the old man. The face appeared again and again, the surprised eyes, the slightly open mouth. It was not an accusing ghost, it was worse. It was a confused ghost, a specter of lost innocence. Jake turned over in his bunk, sweat soaking his pillow despite the air-conditioned chill. He felt an overwhelming guilt, irrational but all-powerful. If he had been faster, if he had shot better, if he hadn't been there at all, and the what-ifs were a form of torture. He got up and went to the small window of the container, looking out at the floodlit darkness of the base. He felt like a murderer. The war, he realized, didn't end when the shooting stopped. It just moved inside, laying siege to his mind. It was Tex who found him. The quiet Texan, who seemed to have a sixth sense for silent suffering, got up from his own bunk and walked over to Jake, who was still standing at the window. Tex didn't say anything. He just stood beside Jake, shoulder to shoulder, looking out at the same darkness. The silence stretched for several minutes, but it wasn't an empty silence. It was a silence of acknowledgement, of witness. Tex was saying without words, "I see you. I know. I'm here too." Then he held out his hand. In it was a crumpled pack of cigarettes and a lighter. Jake didn't smoke, but he took one. They went outside to the designated smoking area, a small corral of concrete and sandbags. They sat on a makeshift bench and lit the cigarettes, the orange embers glowing in the dark. They smoked in silence, the act of inhaling and exhaling a form of controlled breathing, a small ritual against the chaos. The smoke tasted bitter, but it was real, something to focus on. It was Diaz who finally joined them, carrying 2 bottles of water. He didn't make any jokes. He just sat down and handed them the water. In that moment, under the stars of a foreign sky, surrounded by the hum of the war machine, the 3 of them shared a silent sacrament. It was not about absolution. It was about solidarity. It was brotherhood in its purest form. Not about words of comfort, but about the unwavering presence of men who had faced the same abyss and refused to let one of their own fall into it alone. Waking up the next morning was an act of violence. The sound of the alarm was an assault, and for a disorienting fraction of a second, Jake didn't know where he was. Then, the memory of the previous night, of the firefight, of the dead man's face, hit him with the force of a physical punch. He felt an overwhelming urge to curl up in his sleeping bag, to hide from the daylight, to refuse to participate. But then he heard the sounds around him, the creaking of other bunks, the sound of boots being laced up, the low murmur of men preparing for another day. The machine didn't stop. The war didn't take days off for grief or trauma. He forced himself out of bed, his muscles aching, his mind heavy, as lead. The act of putting on his uniform, of lacing his boots, of donning his body armor, felt different now. It was no longer a rehearsal. It was the reality of his profession. Each piece of gear felt heavier, laden with the weight of what happened the day before. As he stepped outside for the morning formation, the Iraqi sun seemed harsher, the air drier, the colors of the desert more faded. He saw the same exhaustion and the same veiled shock in the faces of his teammates. They had crossed their threshold together. The innocence, however little they still possessed, had been permanently burned away. They were now combat veterans, a designation that sounded grand, but which really just meant that they had survived their first encounter with death, and now knew without a shadow of a doubt that it would be coming for them again. The patrols that followed were different. The tension, which had once been a sharp, unfamiliar anxiety, now settled into their bones like a chronic illness. Jacob Barnes began to learn to read the language of the street, a language written in silences, in glances, in anomalies. He learned that a busy street was a safe street, and that a sudden, unnatural quiet was a precursor to violence. He learned to watch the children. They were the city's barometer. If they were playing in the street, things were calm. If they suddenly vanished, it was time to find cover. He learned to distrust kindness as much as hostility. A smile could be an invitation or a lure. A wave could be a greeting or a signal. He became an expert in details, the way the dust settled differently on a patch of disturbed earth, the tire tracks that didn't belong, the absence of birds on a telephone wire. His brain was being rewired, turning into a real-time threat analysis computer. It was a mentally exhausting state of being. He could no longer have a conversation with Diaz in the Humvee without a part of his mind constantly scanning the rooftops and the ditches. The beauty of a desert sunset was overshadowed by the worry that the glare might hide the glint of a sniper's scope. He was becoming good at his job. He was becoming a hunter, and the cost of becoming a good hunter was that he was losing the ability to be anything else. Life on the Forward Operating Base, FOB, was a study in surrealism. It was a fortified enclave of Americana, imposed upon the desert landscape, and the juxtaposition was constantly jarring. After a 12-hour patrol where he had navigated streets filled with danger and poverty, Jake could come back and an hour later be sitting in an air-conditioned dining facility, watching an NFL game on a big-screen television and eating ice cream. He could go to a well-equipped gym and run on a treadmill, looking out through a bulletproof window at the vastness of the Iraqi desert. There were movie nights, poker tournaments, a chapel, a library. They were desperate attempts to simulate normalcy, to create a bubble of sanity in the midst of madness. But for Jake, this forced normalcy was more disorienting than the war itself. It created a cognitive dissonance that left him feeling dizzy. How could he care about the outcome of a football game when, earlier that day, he had held the hand of a wounded comrade, How could he enjoy a movie when the sound of simulated explosions made him jump? He found that he preferred the brutal honesty of the patrol. Outside the wire, the rules were simple and clear: survive. Inside, he had to pretend. He was a normal young American, a role he no longer knew how to play. The base was not a refuge, it was a stage, and every soldier was an actor, playing the part of someone who wasn't being slowly undone by the war. The primary focus of their operations became the hunt for the most dangerous and cowardly enemy, the IED. The patrols transformed into slow, agonizing processions, the Humvees moving at a walking pace, while everyone's eyes scanned every inch of the road ahead. It was a war waged against inanimate objects: a plastic bag on the side of the road, a cardboard box, a pile of rocks that didn't look natural. Everything was suspect. Everything was a potential threat. The tension inside the vehicle was so thick, it was almost physical. No one spoke. The only sound was the crackle of the radio and the hum of the engine. Jake felt the sweat run down his back, his eyes burning from the strain of concentrating, trying to find the subtle detail that could save their lives. It was a form of psychological torture that wore down their nerves day after day. It made them paranoid, suspicious of everything and everyone. A child waving could be a distraction. A broken-down car could be a car bomb. The entire landscape became a minefield, and they were the human mine detectors. It was an inversion of the natural order of things. Instead of looking for signs of life, they were looking for signs of death. And the constant tension of living in this state of high alert, day after day, patrol after patrol, began to take its toll, leaving them exhausted, irritable, and perpetually on edge. The confirmation of their worst fears and the validation of their paranoia came on a hot, cloudless afternoon. Their convoy was moving along a route they had traveled a dozen times before, a path so familiar that complacency was a real temptation. It was Tex who, with his farmer's eyes that seemed to see the world in a higher resolution, noticed the anomaly. "Stop the vehicle," he said calmly. Into his headset, the Humvee lurched to a halt, the rest of the convoy stopping behind them. "What have you got, Tex?" the squad leader asked over the radio. "About 50 meters ahead, right side. The dog carcass." Jake looked. There was a dead dog on the side of the road, a common and sad sight. "So what?" another soldier said. "Wasn't there this morning," Tex replied. "We passed through here at 800. It wasn't there." The calm in Tex's voice was more alarming than any scream. They followed. Protocol. The perimeter was established. The Explosive Ordnance Disposal EOD team was called. What followed were 2 tense hours of waiting under the sun, the soldiers kneeling behind their vehicles, weapons pointed at the emptiness. Finally, the EOD robot approached the carcass. The voice of the EOD tech crackled over the radio, cool and professional. "Confirmed. Pressure plate initiated device made with 2 155 meters artillery shells. You guys were meters from becoming smoke." They conducted a controlled detonation that shook the ground and sent a cloud of dust and debris into the sky. That night, no one celebrated. They just sat in silence, each man contemplating the thin line between life and death, and the fact that they owed their lives to the keen observation of a quiet farmer from Texas. The aftermath of the near miss with the IED was not one of relief, but of a quiet terror. The understanding of how close they had come to total annihilation settled over the platoon like a shroud. Death was no longer an abstract concept or something that happened to other people. It had drawn near, brushed against their shoulders, and whispered in their ears. That night in the barracks, the usual camaraderie gave way to a somber introspection. The men sat on their bunks, lost in their own thoughts, the reality of their mortality now undeniable. Jake watched his teammates and saw the price that proximity to death exacted. Diaz, who was normally a source of energy, was quiet, his eyes vacant. Tex, the hero of the day, seemed haunted, as if the burden of having saved their lives was almost as heavy as it would have been to have lost them. The experience bound them even closer, but it also isolated them. They now shared a terrible knowledge that separated them from everyone else in the world. How could they ever explain to their loved ones the feeling of being seconds away from being vaporized, and then continuing to live as if nothing had happened? The war, Jake realized, wasn't just about surviving the explosions. It was about surviving the knowledge of them. It was about carrying the weight of the what-ifs, of the alternate realities where a quiet farmer from Texas didn't look in the right place at the right time. The ghost of the old civilian who died in the first firefight did not leave Jacob Barnes. It became a permanent resident in his psyche. He needed a name. The designation collateral damage was an abomination, a bureaucratic erasure of a life. On a rare afternoon off, Jake sought out one of the local interpreters who worked on the base, an older man named Ahmed with kind, tired eyes. Under the guise of being interested in local culture, Jake vaguely described the street and the shop where the firefight had taken place. He asked about the old shopkeeper. Ahmed listened patiently and then nodded slowly. "Ah, you mean Hajj Ali," he said. "He was a good man. His family lived on that street for generations. He sold the best sweets in the city." Hajj Ali. The name was simple, common, but for Jake, it gave the ghost a face, a history. He was no longer an abstraction. He was Hajj Ali, a candy seller, a good man. The information did not alleviate Jake's guilt. In fact, it deepened it, made it more specific, more personal, but it also gave him something to focus on. Hajj Ali was no longer a symbol of the tragedy of war. He was the tragedy itself. And Jake's burden now had a name, a weight, and a shape. He would never forget Hajj Ali. One afternoon, after an exhausting patrol, there was a mail call. Jake received a letter from his parents, the envelope covered in stamps and postmarks, looking like an artifact from a distant world. He took it to his bunk and opened it, the familiar smell of paper from home filling his nostrils, a scent so strange and alien in that environment of dust and disinfectant, it almost made him cry. The letter was a dispatch from another planet, a planet of peace and normalcy. His mother wrote about her garden, about how the tomatoes were growing well this year. His father wrote about the Cleveland Indians complaining about the bullpen. They wrote about a neighbor's new car, about a cousin's wedding. They were the chronicles of life, of continuity, of a world that hadn't stopped because he had left. And every word of normalcy was like a knife in his heart. How could he reconcile the image of his mother's tomatoes with the image of Hajj Ali's body in the street? How could he care about a baseball game when he was playing a game of life and death every day? The letter, meant to be a comfort, only deepened his sense of isolation. It highlighted the uncrossable chasm that now separated him from his old life. He folded the letter and put it away, the piece of paper feeling like a brick in his pocket. He loved his parents with every fiber of his being, but he realized they no longer knew him, and maybe it was better that way. His internal struggle did not go unnoticed. Sergeant Carver had an ability to see the cracks in his men's armor. One day after a training drill, Carver called Jake aside. He didn't ask if Jake was okay. He knew he wasn't. Instead, he offered Jake a cigarette. They stood in silence for a moment, smoking under the harsh sun. "You're thinking about the old man," Carver said. It wasn't a question. "How do you know?" Jake asked, surprised. Carver took a long drag. "'Cause everyone's got one," he said. "Mine was a little girl with a red ribbon in her hair. Afghanistan, 2005. We were in a firefight. She ran into the street." He didn't finish the story. He didn't have to. "You carry it," Carver continued, his voice low. "He's yours now. He's going to live in your head for the rest of your life. The question isn't how to get rid of him. You can't. The question is what you do with him. Do you let him destroy you, or do you use him to remind you why we're here, to remind you what happens when good men do nothing?" He dropped the cigarette on the ground and crushed it with his boot. "You can't change what happened, Barnes, but you can honor his memory by doing your job right and bringing all your men home. That's all any of us can do." Carver's lesson offered no absolution, but it offered a purpose. The burden didn't disappear, but suddenly it felt a little less heavy. The crack in Jake's hardened shell came from the most unlikely of sources. They were on a foot patrol in a small village, the tension in the air as thick as the dust. The people watched them with a mixture of fear and resentment. Suddenly, a small girl, maybe 5 or 6 years old, with dark, curious eyes and a colorful, tattered dress, darted away from her mother and ran towards Jake. Jake's heart jumped into his throat. Diaz moved to intercept her, but Jake held up a hand. The girl stopped in front of him, looked at his rifle, then up at his face. She didn't look scared, just curious. She held out her hand. In her small, dirty palm was a single piece of hard candy, wrapped in cellophane. She offered it to Jake. a small gesture of humanity in the middle of the inhumanity of war. Jake hesitated for a moment, his training screaming about booby traps and lures, but he looked into the girl's eyes, and he saw only innocence. He knelt, his knee protesting, and with his gloved hands he took the candy. "Shukran," he said, one of the few Arabic words he knew. "Thank you." The girl smiled, a bright, toothless grin, before her mother snatched her up and dragged her inside. Jake knelt for a moment, looking at the small piece of candy in his hand. He didn't eat it. He tucked it into a pouch on his vest. That small gesture, that unexpected moment of connection, was the first light he had seen in weeks. It didn't change the reality of the war, but it reminded him that even in the darkest of places, humanity could still bloom. The weeks turned into months, and the desert began to work its slow, inexorable alchemy on Jacob Barnes and his team. The change was not sudden but gradual, a steady erosion of their former selves. The sharp, paralyzing fear of the first weeks was replaced by something colder and more functional, a professional caution. They didn't become fearless. They became experts in fear, learning how to manage it, to use it as a tool to keep it in a compartment of their minds while the job needed to be done. Their humor grew darker, their jokes more macabre, a private language of trauma that only they understood. Their movements became more efficient, their bodies leaner and harder, stripped of any superfluous fat by the heat and the stress. The most noticeable change was in their eyes. The light of youth had been extinguished, replaced by an older, more tired gaze. The same look Jake had seen in the departing veterans when he first arrived. They were adapting. They were surviving. But survival had a cost. Jake felt it in the way he reacted, or rather, the way he no longer reacted. A distant car bomb, which once would have made him jump, now barely warranted a glance. He was becoming hardened, his soul developing a callus to protect itself from the constant friction of horror. He was becoming an effective combat soldier, and he knew, somewhere deep and quiet, that he was losing the man he once was. When the second firefight happened, Jacob Barnes's reaction was completely different from the first. They were on a night patrol when an ambush was sprung from a dark alley. This time, there was no shock, no hesitation, no stretching and compressing of time. There was only a cold, instant clarity. The moment he heard the first shot, before his conscious brain could even register the sound, his body was already in motion, diving for cover. His rifle was at his shoulder, his sights finding the enemy muzzle flashes. His shots were not panicked sprays, but controlled, precise bursts. He was not just shooting, he was fighting. He communicated with his team in short bursts of tactical jargon, his voice calm and steady over the radio. "Diaz, suppressive fire, text left flank." He moved with a fluidity that would have surprised him months ago, violence a second nature. The battle was short, brutal, and efficient. They overwhelmed the enemy, silencing the threat. When it was over, Jake didn't feel the nausea or the shaking of the first contact. He felt nothing. Just the hum of adrenaline and a cold satisfaction at having executed his job with proficiency. He had become the weapon Carver had trained him to be, calm, efficient, and lethal. And the absence of emotion, the ease with which he had participated in that violent dance, was the most frightening thing he had ever felt. The ride back to the base after the second firefight was silent, just like the first time. But it was a different kind of silence. It was not the shocked, traumatized silence of the aftermath of their first battle. It was the tired, professional silence of men who have just finished a dangerous day's work. They were not processing horror. They were processing tactics. "Did you see how they used that car for cover?" Diaz said, his voice low and analytical. "We need to train for that." "Their sector of fire was weak on the left flank," Tex added. "We exploited it well." They were dissecting the event, not as a near-death experience, but as a tactical problem they had solved. The emotion had been compartmentalized, put away to be examined later, or perhaps never. Jake participated in the conversation, his mind replaying every moment, every decision. He felt a sense of pride in the way his team had performed, in the way he himself had led. But underneath the professional pride, there was an undercurrent of dread. The ease with which they now spoke of violence, the naturalness with which they dissected a deadly gunfight. The war was changing them, molding them into its own image. The new silence in the Humvee was not about what had happened. It was about what they were becoming. That night, back in his bunk after robotically cleaning his rifle, Jacob Barnes sat in the darkness. He took out his grandfather's compass. He flipped open the metal lid, its small click loud in the silence. The phosphorescent needle glowed in the dark, quivering for a moment before settling, pointing steadfastly north. He thought of his father giving him the object, telling him it would help him remember the way home. He stared at the steady needle and thought of his own sense of direction. Before the war, his moral north had seemed just as clear and unwavering as the magnetic north. There was right and wrong. There was honor and dishonor. But the desert had demagnetized his soul. What was right when a decision could lead to the death of his men or an innocent? What was honorable in a war fought in the shadows against a faceless enemy? The needle in his hand pointed to a physical place, a place of green fields and familiar streets in Ohio. But he realized that his own internal north, his moral compass, was now spinning wildly, lost in a new brutal magnetic field of survival and violence. He closed the compass. Finding his way back to Ohio would be the easy part. The real war, he was beginning to understand, would be the long journey to try and find north again within himself. Weeks later, while shaving over a stainless steel sink in the communal bathroom, Jake caught a glimpse of his own reflection. He paused, the razor in his hand, and truly looked at himself for the first time in a long time. The face staring back at him was an eroded version of himself. The boyish roundness was gone, replaced by sharper, leaner angles. His skin, once pale, was now a permanent reddish tan, a mask that the desert sun had baked onto his face. There were new, fine lines around his eyes, etched by months of squinting against the glare and peering into the darkness. But the most profound change was in his eyes. They were the eyes of the veterans he had seen when he first arrived. They were no longer the eyes of a kid from Ohio. They were older, quieter, and they held a knowledge that he would never be able to unlearn. There was a stillness in them, an absence of illusion. They were the eyes of a man who had seen death up close, who had participated in it, and who had learned to live with it as a constant companion. He didn't recognize the boy who had enlisted with dreams of honor. He saw a stranger, a survivor, a man who had been unmade and remade by the war, and he wasn't sure if he liked the man he saw. There was no single moment of epiphany, but rather a slow, gradual acceptance of his new reality. Jacob Barnes had adapted. The state of hypervigilance, which was once a stress response, became his natural state of being. The weight of the body armor became as familiar as his own clothes. The camaraderie with his fire team became the primary relationship in his life, deeper and more honest than any he had ever known. The fear didn't disappear, but it changed. It was no longer an overwhelming panic, but a cold, calculating companion, a voice in his ear that kept him sharp, that kept him alive. He learned to compartmentalize, to build walls in his mind, to separate the soldier he was on patrol from the man he tried to be in the barracks. He learned to laugh at jokes that would have turned his stomach months ago. He learned to sleep, even with the distant sound of mortars. He had become an effective combat soldier. The war had taken him to the breaking point and forged him into something new. He had survived. But as he looked out at the endless desert horizon, he wondered what he had lost in the process. The transformation was complete. The boy from Ohio was now a memory, a ghost from a distant, peaceful land. In his place stood Private Barnes, a creature of the war, perfectly adapted to a world of sand, steel, and death. And the question that haunted him in the quiet of the desert nights was whether, when the war was over, he would ever be able to adapt back to peace.